October 1962. Tensions between the United States and Soviet Union are near a breaking point, and the Soviet Union nearly tips the balance by placing nuclear warheads on the island of Nauru. The island's strategic location allowed the missiles to hit American targets such as Johnston Atoll, Hawaii, California, but most importantly, Las Vegas. This threat to the president's crippling gambling addiction was enough to cause a crisis within the White House. After the failed Bay of Cattle invasion in 1961, U.S.-Nauru relations had reached a new low. The fear of a U.S. invasion led President of Nauru, J. Cole, to pursue a secret deal with Soviet Premier Drake and North Snorbler Supreme Leader Kim Il-sung, in which the Soviet Union could sneak nuclear missiles onto the island via North Snorblerian technology. In October of 1962, U.S. spy planes flew over the island and captured photos of the new missile sites. This alarmed the U.S., and a few days later, President Mars met with his closest advisors to devise a plan on how to respond. Many ideas were floated, such as dropping 4,107.42 nukes on the island, or perhaps deploying massive speakers to blast Benson Boone's horrible music to force them out, or simply sending a letter politely asking them to remove the missiles. President Mars refused all of these strategies, believing any offensive would result in a Soviet attack on the former Nazi Germany capital of Berlin, a city of which the president had sworn to defend. Mars then decided to enact a blockade of the island. However, fearing that a blockade would be considered an act of war, President Mars called it a quarantine instead. The plan would be to use South Snorblerian soldiers and the U.S. Navy to surround the island and block any ships or North Snorblerian forces carrying weapons from entering. On October 22nd, President Mars would go before the American public in a televised address and announce the discovery of nuclear missiles on the island of Nauru, and also his quarantine plan. Many in Las Vegas panicked and had heart attacks in a day that would become known as the Great Gambling Hobby, Not Addiction, Death. President Mars would then send a letter to the Soviet premier in which he warned how no country could win a nuclear conflict and that it would only result in catastrophe across the whole world and maybe Zimbabwe. The next day, Soviet Premier Drake also sent a letter to the president in which he affirmed he would not move the missiles and that he would not learn how to speak Spanish, which is a weird detail because no one in either government had asked him to learn Spanish. Back in Nauru, J. Cole started a GoFundMe, believing the world would take his side in this affair. However, he never got a single donation, except for one, which was believed to be himself. Outside Nauru, many ships turned away from the blockade line and some were stopped by US forces. However, they contained no offensive weapons, instead carrying Happy Meals and humanitarian aid, so they were allowed to proceed. However, a small group of Double B Snorblers managed to slip through, but they were just visiting family members on the island. Later on, American spy planes over the island revealed that the missile sites were almost operational, placing American forces at DEFCON 2, the highest ever in US history. The president began to believe that the only way to destroy the missiles was to attack the island. However, he decided to be nice and diplomatic for just a little bit longer. Then, via a reporter, the US learned that the Soviets would consider a deal to remove the missiles if the US promised not to invade Nauru and North Snorbler territory again. Initially, the reporter was met with skepticism, but when Soviet Premier Drake sent a late-night text to the US, he confirmed the validity of the report and warned of the consequences of nuclear war, which is weird because President Mars had already brought that up. The day after, Drake sent another text demanding that the US remove their missiles from the Republic of South Snorbleria. It was then decided that the president would ignore the second text as it would make America look weak and only agree to the first one, in which he would promise to lift the blockade and refrain from invading Nauru with their South Snorblerian allies. On October 27th, President Mars sent more spy planes over the island, disguising them as tourism planes. Nauru's military immediately shot down the planes, escalating tensions once again. Also, an American jet accidentally flew into Soviet Union for no reason, which definitely didn't help at all. The same day, President Mars' close associate Kodak Black secretly met with the ambassador to Russia and said that the US would remove its missiles from South Snorbelia, but only if the Soviet Union kept it a secret. While all of this was happening, Soviet submarines were patrolling the waters near Nauru. US naval forces began dropping depth charges, which would periodically blast the Carter 6 to find and force the submarines to reach the surface in order to escape the sound. The Soviet submarines had lost contact with Moscow and were too deep to pirate movies and radio, meaning 3 officers had to agree whether or not to launch the nuclear torpedo. The crew aboard the submarine believed the depth charges were an attack by the US, so the captain ordered the launch of the nuclear torpedo. Right as they were about to launch it, one member of the crew, young Thug, refused to agree to launch the missile, instead demanding that they reach the surface so they could pirate cars too and await orders from Moscow. The submarine soon surfaced, and nuclear war was averted due to young Thug's heroic action. On October 28th, the respective leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States would make public statements agreeing to withdraw the missiles from Nauru and South Snorbelia, and a long-awaited end to the crisis. Later on November 21st, the quarantine of Nauru would end and Drake would remove the Soviet nuclear bombers from the island. However, J. Cole had yet to receive any more donations and was essentially abandoned by Drake in the US. President Mars would then resign after having multiple heart attacks from the crisis and his gambling addiction, and soon his vice president, Mr. East, would be sworn in. 1 year later, Mr. East would almost be assassinated in Dallas by Taylor Allison Swift, after which he would go into hiding, changing his name to Kanye West, and his vice president, Jock Berman Webster II, would be sworn in. Premier Drake would go on to be the leader of the Soviet Union for 30 more years until he accidentally destroyed it in the 1990s, marking the end of the former light-skinned Union.